So welcome back, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. All right. So the intent for the next couple of subsections here is for the updates from the subgroup. So, the idea is just to kind of give an update, a little bit on the conversations you've had in the subgroups, maybe some initial recommendations you've been contemplating. I know Scott's been working with all of you to be able to put some of that material to, or at least some of the thoughts together. We can discuss those here. Some of the stuff we already came up here when we did the capital projects funding discussion here, and what we may want to do and what we may want to recommend. So that should be an interesting, robust discussion. As the subgroups give the updates, I think what would be great is if let's have questions for them, let's have comments, and then once those kind of dry up, we'll move on to the next subgroup. So with that, let's start with the first subgroup, which is the mapping and speed goals. Nolan had a conflict that wasn't able to come on. So maybe Bernadine and Steve Georgie, you can kind of give us an update on the discussions you've been having on that topic. Oh, you're on mute, Bernadine.
Sorry, you bet, Teddy. And Scott, I've got the document pulled up here. So what I'm going to do is just I want to express to the whole task force our appreciation for Scott's work and the template that came from Collectivity. That proved really useful to us and helped us kind of get focused on the recommendations themselves. And we've been in there and met a couple times as a team and begun to scope out the shape of the recommendations that we're anticipating bringing forward. And so I think what I'll do in the few minutes we have, Teddy, is just kind of tick off the base recommendations, and these are not wordsmiths, so this is just kind of the essence here, not the details of what we're talking about. And we'll start out with the mapping. So as Teddy said, mapping and speed goals subgroup. So on the mapping, and again, and I'll just say maybe this word of context, that we are trying to think through the lens of what is our role as a task force to say to the legislature, and what should the legislature be hearing from us and keeping in mind. So the first recommendation sounds a little anodyne maybe, but we think it's important that it be said and that we say it to the legislature. So the first recommendation we're talking about is that the state of Minnesota should continue to invest public dollars in maintaining broadband maps. Not every state does that. We do it. We think it's important that they hear that from us, that's a recommendation that we continue to invest public dollars in maintaining state broadband maps. The second recommendation under mapping kind of follows along with that, and it says something like the intent is around that the state of Minnesota should strive to achieve ISP cooperation in producing address-level broadband maps. So something that calls out the fact that we want our state to strive towards address-level maps. There's some work that's been done by CNS and others that have created township data maps, and so we think there's something to point to there. The third mapping recommendation is that the state of Minnesota should follow the example of other states and play a role in sponsoring and promulgating the continued use of crowdsourced maps. So those are the four, and so let me say too that we've kind of thrown this up against the wall. We and our group haven't sorted through where we're going to land, but this is the kind of the trailheads that we're talking about as a team. Teddy, do you want me to stop there on the mapping or should I go ahead and just say we have a few under speed and then a couple other random? What do you think would be most productive?
Yeah, I think you can keep going. In the meantime, I would encourage others on the task force to raise a hand or put comments in the chat, and then we can address them as they go.
Okay, super. So we have just a single recommendation at this point that we're contemplating bringing forward to the task force on the speed goal. It does, so I'll just say this, what we're thinking about. The task force recommends that the legislature require that all future expenditures of state broadband grant dollars must be spent on service that delivers 100 megabits download and 100 upload at the time of deployment. that all future expenditures of state broadband. So that's what we're thinking about in terms of speed. So we're not coming in with a new speed goal requirement, but rather a requirement that the state broadband dollars be spent in on systems that at the time of turn up are 100 by 100. And then there's a few other recommendations that we have been talking about as a group that we anticipate may show up from other task forces. A lot of this stuff overlaps, and it's great to have Scott and his team in all of these because it helps pull the threads together. But we're also considering a recommendation around the cable franchise system that would create more competition. We also are going to recommend that would like to see that we bring forward as a task force the recommendation included in last year's report around state investment in broadband adoption. And you guys will recall that we did that last year with a number in there that the OPD came up with for us, 1.5 million to promote broadband adoption and use and redress digital inequity, which is so we're going to be recommending that recommendation from our 2021 report around funding the office to do adoption and redress digital inequity with program dollars be included. Analogously, anticipating that we would also, as a task force, recommend the continued funding of the grant program going forward. And then also considering a recommendation, wondering if this might come up from others, about how to redress supply chain shortages, which are turning out to be a real barrier to deployment. For example, could the state play a role as a wholesale purchaser of fiber or other supplies using ARPA funds? Along that line, there may be, in addition to wholesale purchasing, there may be a recommendation that we end up bringing forward around investing in meeting particular workforce needs for the tech sector. Those who've been on the task force will recall that in the past we have called out cybersecurity, for example, as an area for state investment in tech workforce. I think that's it. Brian, Steve, did I miss anything from that you wanted to add or correct what I said? Otherwise, I think that's an outline of where we're at, Teddy, under recommendations.
Bernadine, I think on the speed goal, there was a nuance in there that the group talked about where the capability at the time of deployment was 100 by 100, but the actual service offering at the time of deployment may be less than that, like 100 by 20, for instance. So that the technology itself was capable of 100 by 100, but the provider may offer a package that is 100 by 20. I'm not sure how we've landed on that nuance in terms of the language of the recommendation, but I think that was part of the discussion.
Teresa, I know you have a couple of comments in the chat. Maybe you want to come off mute and.
Yes, right now it is scalable, 100 by 100. Providers sometimes don't want to use that extra. It's excessive. The upstream, most people do not need it. If they do, they get a fiber dedicated line to their home or business. You brought up cable franchising. Minnesota Statute 238, cable franchising across the nation actually is for video TV services only. Just a note there.
Brian, I know you have your hand up.
Thanks, Teddy, and thanks, Bernadine. I think in Diane's report, she talked a little bit about the federal requirement also looking at 100 megabits, but also scalable if there was maybe reason it could be 100 by 20. Is there any value, Bernadine, in maybe just adopting the federal standards, being that we're going to be using the federal money to fund our program? Just a thought.
I'm excited that we get to hear input from the full task force on this to take back into our committee, and I think we still need as a committee to talk a bit more about the details of this, but this is kind of where we're headed, that the point I think we're trying to achieve is that public dollars be invested in systems that are as robust as possible for the future, so we don't have to go back and reinvest public dollars again later. So that's what we're trying to get at without opening that whole Pandora's box of claiming whole new swaths of Minnesota as unserved. Rather ensure that future public investments are, if you would, future-proof.
Sorry, I was on mute. Steve Fensky, you have a question first, and Mark Johnson.
Well, I was asking with this change, is it really a change in practice? So my question was to Angie, maybe Diane. My recollection was that all the projects in 2020 already met the 2026 goal, which was the 100 by 20. And if that's the case, is this really proposing any change on any provider if they're already doing that?
Yeah, Steve, that's why I didn't really agree with what Scott said about the nuance in our discussion. I think that is the difference, and that so I think we need to flesh it out a little bit more, because I think you're right, Steve, that currently so the change would be that difference, that they have to be not just scalable to 100 by 100, but actually deliver 100 by 100.
Well, and secondly,
And the question of what service package is offered might be a separate question, Scott.
I agree. And the other piece is, what is exactly scalable? Because it's not a defined term. Does that mean it can go up to 100 by 100 on delivery, which I don't think is what it means, or is it can eventually be built to that?
Yeah, that's really helpful, Steve. I think that's the point. We are trying to have obviate the need for additional further investment to get to 100 by 100, and so that's at least my intent. And we, as you can see, we haven't fully hashed this out as a group, but that there would be a difference, because the way you describe it, there would not be no change than existing practice. And we are trying to lean into a change so that future networks do deliver upon build 100 by 100.
Mark, I know you had your hand up, and I went under.
Yeah, I thought my question, I'm going to wait to hear from the underserved and funding group, because my question might be more applicable based on what they have. So.
Okay. You, Georgie? No, Steve, you're on mute. Or...
Part of our conversation too is because we are not able to issue any border-to-border grants this year to help us meet the 2022 goal of 25.3 statewide, that we need to make sure the legislature understands the importance of the 2026 goal and how we need to excel above and beyond that. So I think that's why we're kind of pushing the 100 post-it comment recommendation.
Any other questions, comments?
I have one related to reliability that came up in discussion in one of our subgroup meetings. This is Yvonne, by the way. Interrupted service, or service that slows significantly at various times, even if you have high speed, is a problem that citizens complain about. They may have high speed connection, but if it's off for hours at a time or stops unexpectedly in the middle of a video conference. We heard from some experts that they don't have great measures of reliability because it's longitudinal data that you need to gather. There's a couple of tools like continuous bandwidth testers and that sort of thing that are available online that people can run. But I just want to bring that up and ask if the subgroup has talked at all about reliability testing and about, perhaps working with providers to make those types of tools more available to their customers, or maybe using those themselves and then publishing longitudinal results so that people can see the reliability of the service.
Bernadine, Steve, any comments?
Yeah, thanks, Yvonne, for that. We haven't, but thanks to you, we will.
Okay, other questions and comments? I'm not seeing any hands up. Bernadine, great update. Steve, you as well. I think this is exactly right. Like, we don't have anything figured out yet, right? Like, this is just the initial sort of discussions and highlighting that. I think the next round will get a little bit tighter, and then we'll put it together so we can have a more comprehensive discussion. But I thought that was a great start and a good way to start putting some of the thoughts down on paper and have this sort of initial discussion. So more to come on that one. So with that, let's turn over to the next subgroup, the accessibility, affordability, and education. And Yvonne, I'll let you take the lead on this.
Hi, Mark, I'm going to give you a heads up. I'm going to be asking you to talk about your recommendations in a second, so be ready. We met September 21st, got a presentation from Elliot Christensen from the Lower Sioux community. One of the things they talked about was their challenges relating to existing providers claiming that their geography is fully covered by their systems when they're not. So that might be something else for the mapping group to, just have in your feather in your information. They're looking to make broadband a really central part of future plans for development, and to a certain extent trying to raise funds and do things on their own to fill in some of those gaps. I thought that was really interesting. Mark put together some great recommendations related to education, so I was going to have him share those recommendations with the group so that he can get the wording just right. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, and thanks, Yvonne, and thanks everybody. It's just like the other group. These are not, I have not wordsmithed them. They're still concepts. We're still thinking about how this might look and whether these are, should go forward. But what I will say is that, our group is, accessibility, affordability, and education. And the issues in education are really about accessibility and affordability. So it really fits together well. I think one of the things we talked about, and if you heard Jeff Plowman talk from the Department of Education at our last meeting, he's a one-man show, a one-person show at the Department of Education. And what we've found, if you talk to folks in education, if we've heard from others, there's a real lack of leadership in education technology in the state. There are a number of regions in the state we've tried to sort of take on that role, but it becomes very disjointed. So one of the things we're thinking about or kicking around is that it's somewhat ancillary, but not really to the broadband issue, is to establish a coordinator of education technology position within the Department of Education. That would be somebody who could be the leader in terms of making sure there's all these funding things that have come up, right, with ARPA and ESSER and all these kinds of things. And there's really been no central leadership in the state about how do districts take advantage of that funding and use it toward broadband. I mean, they've been given money for hotspots and for devices and for all these things, which doesn't really help anything if they've got poor access. So to have that leadership, somebody that could then work with the Office of Broadband Development, put their heads together and help districts understand what they can do to help families. I'll give you an example. The FCC came out with this emergency broadband benefit, which was to provide families with money to help defer the cost of broadband. Now, it didn't help them get better broadband necessarily, but it helped them pay for a better access if they could get it from their provider. But again, no direct state leadership to districts about how they get that information out to their families. And then the other thing is one of the qualifying pieces, one of the ways that a family can qualify for that benefit is through free and reduced lunch. And right now there's a program in schools that provides free lunch to everybody. So families aren't filling out their educational benefits form, which then affects districts in lots of other ways. But again, a little leadership could help districts understand that those things go hand in hand. and could get that information to them and get information to families. It could also help coordinate efforts to draw providers into areas that are underserved, things like that. So from the broadband standpoint, it's not really about direct providing broadband, but having some leadership for schools around issues that involve broadband. So that's one thing. Another thing is, and it sort of came up a little bit, and Bernadine mentioned about state investment in broadband adoption. And that almost moves into that idea of digital navigation, and to provide the Office of Broadband some funding, to help with that process, to help provide those services, to help people understand what is even available to them. That's the idea of digital navigation. What can they do? Who can they turn to get information, and so on. So that's another one. And then always near and dear to my heart is the State Telecommunications and Internet Access Equity Aid Program, which is a funding source for school districts themselves to pay for their broadband. And we are seeing right now tremendous increases in the need for broadband in schools itself. Schools are well served, but they need to keep buying more bandwidth because now virtually every school is a one-to-one program. And that is expensive in certain parts of the state, depending on your geography, depending on where you are, and it's pretty inequitable in terms of how much per student a district has to pay for the broadband access that they need. So those are a few that we're working on, and there may be some others that come to the surface as well. I'll leave it at that.
Another idea kicking around related to accessibility came from a conversation with Alicia Munson and Marion Christensen from ARC that came and spoke to our subgroup, talking about how broadband provides education options for medically fragile children and adults, recovery education, access to employment, even transportation apps for folks that need to arrange for rides for therapies and medicine, that sort of thing. Folks with disabilities might have a harder time communicating with providers. One thing that came up also from my past history too is thinking of some way to make a recommendation, I don't know how to word this yet, around expanding awareness for the need for universally accessible websites. And a way for us to talk to both providers and obviously government websites are all supposed to be universally accessible. Many are not tested regularly to make sure that they maintain that accessibility. And provider websites are kind of notoriously bad in terms of their ADA compliance. So that's something we need to think about, and I'd like to have some sort of a recommendation in there about that. I think that's all we have so far, unless anybody else on our subgroup has something that I've missed. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Yvonne. Any questions, comments for the subgroup? But there's some really good thoughts in there, things we can crystallize into formal recommendations. Hands go up when anybody coming off mute. So with that, let's transition to the update from the and discussion from the last subgroup. So the underserved, underserved, and funding. And I know we'll have some discussion here. So with that, Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Teddy. So really what we took a crack at was, getting at the unserved, if you will. We've, I think, roughly have more than 140,000 locations or something to that nature that are unserved. We move the needle. It seems, you spend $20 million, you get 7,000 off the unserved list. And at that rate, we're going to be here forever. Although with that infusion of federal dollars, that would seem to kind of take care of everything, even if it is going to be delayed till, late 2022 at the earliest. So we kind of centered around four kind of recommendations. The current definitions of unserved and underserved should, basically remain the same. And then really once those areas have access to high-speed internet, only then should we really start focusing on, you know, broadband adoption and affordability programs. I mean, this, kind of our feeling is this should really, the primary focus should be the grant program. And it would appear we're going to have a lot of work to do over the next year just in federal compliance and deployment. The other thing is, we've had this philosophy, if you will, of just allocating grants in, every part of the state, every grant round. And, this really should be targeted to those areas that are unserved. If you're not on the internet, if you don't have any ability to get on the internet, it really should focus on those areas. And if possible, maybe we need to think about waiving the 100 synchronous requirement. Steve Georgie has talked about areas in the north where we're just never going to get there with, what some people would consider, a fiber-only option because of the ground. So maybe it's a fixed wireless solution. We just heard from a gentleman today about how they're using that. So, is that waiving the synchronous requirement so that some of those operators out there who've had fixed wireless that have received that, whether it's to the tower or maybe some unique program that gets the equipment into the user as part of our grant program, is something we could consider. And then, if there is going to be kind of a waiver, then, the service obviously would be less likely to install. So there perhaps is a proportionately less amount from the broadband grant program for those recipients as compared to those that are, kind of doing that. It's really kind of talking about geo-targeting to try to get those most hardest to reach areas. I mean, we seem to get these programs or these applications, but we're really looking at what gets those unserved areas of the state, online. And I think that kind of our final recommendation kind of fits into that. Just, basically a one-size-fits-all approach for grant allocation, may not be in the best interest for those that are truly unserved. So just kind of the beginning of the discussion.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, and with 180 million, I think we will be able to do wonders. And focus on doing this. This is our core mission, I thought. When I joined this, it was about the infrastructure. So focus on that, get the people what they need, and do it responsibly.
Other comments from the subgroup before we turn it over for questions and comments? Okay, Steve Georgie.
Oh, I appreciate the subgroup's conversation about, in my mind, kind of re-examining the grant program to reach these, the last mile, the hard to serve, the difficult locations. Is the subcommittee talking about RDOF and how that totally interferes with any progress in far too many areas of the state? If we're going to be handcuffed again by an RDOF designation, we're just, our hands are tied. Our communities up here are just captured because we don't have viable projects because, of an RDOF designation. So I hope there's some conversation on that too.
It's helpful.
Brian, I saw you had your hand up.
I was just going to thank Paul for the comments and, kind of a tagline that I don't know if it was Teresa or Steve that brought it up or even Diane on our committee meeting, but, maybe the funding is instead of what we have for matching funds, maybe it needs to be closer to 75% grant to make it viable because it's not getting done now and it's a 50% match. So what do we need to do to entice it? And to echo Teresa's comment, 180 million will move a lot of opportunities, and I think our goal really needs to get the legislature to make sure that they designate all of that money to the border-to-border broadband program instead of having it go elsewhere to transportation or somewhere else within the realm. So thank you, Paul.
Other questions, comments? Mark, was the question you had maybe relevant now or no?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think Paul, you addressed it. My concern was, are we going to look to reaching those truly unserved areas first when we're doing the program? I think your group is addressing that and talking about ways to do that. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I would, that was really interesting, Paul, and I think if there's a way, for us in the report to be able to highlight what those areas might be, right, to just say, here's the areas that are unserved, right, and then this is where the focus should go, that may narrow it down even further, right?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk to legislators, and they learn about the grant program, and there might, if there's a grant in their districts, they're very excited. But I don't know that many of them understand. Here are from a macro perspective, here are the unserved areas of the state, and I think that could really build some momentum for the program. And buy-in from the legislature to say, let's kind of get this done. Let's get these folks online, so we don't have to hear, from constituents or stories about, taking kids to McDonald's to do homework. I mean, even if it's at 25.3, which most platforms aren't even going to, they're going to deliver much more than that. At least those stories are eliminated, and we can talk about what the future looks like beyond, the grant program. Is it education? Is it technology? Education, technology, workforce, all of those type of things that we can move to once we get everybody online.
Yeah. Diana made a comment in the chat. Capital Projects Fund does not have a match requirement. The state border to border does. So that's something you want to keep in mind. Mark, you had a follow-up question on that one?
Yeah, and I didn't type it exactly right. My question was, since the feds don't require the match, does that allow the border-to-border program to be modified to allow that, or would that take legislation still? That was kind of my question.
Diane, Angie, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm just looking at, what the current law says about the ability of the commissioner. He may temporarily modify program standards to the degree necessary to comply with federal standards for funding received under this section. Probably a gray area.
Okay, interesting.
Take advantage of the gray area and run with it.
Yeah. Angie, you have a comment?
Yeah, I would just add to that. So because border to border as we know it now is going to be funded with federal dollars, we're at it's up to Treasury to approve our program plan. So the program plan we would submit today is border to border as it exists in statute. Whether or not Treasury would sign off on our 50% match requirement, we don't know. So things to keep in mind that, and that's why we pushed for that extra bit of language in statute that allows modification to the program. We didn't want to miss out on the opportunity to receive and utilize federal funding if current parameters in statute didn't align with Treasury's plans.
Okay, thank you for that comment. Any other questions, comments for the subgroup? Thank you. Paul and team, the only other comment that I would have is obviously, as you mentioned earlier, we're going to use the federal dollars, now we have to get the federal dollars, right? So, and that seems to be sort of an interesting path with there's an application, then you have to put the grant program, and that may miss us another season and all that. So if there are things, I mean, that may be a discussion for the subgroup, is like, what can we do to expedite that process? Is there a recommendation we need to make to the governor and the commissioner, because they can make that application soon? And if there is something that we need to do prior to the overall task force document that comes out at the end of the year, if there's something sooner we need to do about that, that could be an interesting thing to discuss as well, right? When we get back together in November. So something for the subgroup to consider. Okay. Steve Georgie.
And on that vein, Teddy, about thinking about it, and I would like perhaps Angie and everybody else to think about too. When the CARES Act came out, remember the dollars came out late in the year, and you had to utilize it by the end of the year. And some of the counties in our state were bold enough to actually designate CARES dollars for broadband projects. Maybe Dave Wolf is one of those who jumped up and said, we can get it done by the end of the year. So within a 3-month time frame, they took on projects that they were able to complete to utilize those dollars. We need to think boldly too, and if we can get approval for the $180 million, we know we have at least $35 million allocated for 2022. Why can't we open up the grant program immediately and allocate grant awards, at the beginning of the year, so there's possible 2022 construction? I just think we have to really think about modifications that will make sense to get us back out in the field, put some fiber in the ground, or get some broadband connection.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, so I think that concludes our main body of business. Any other topics, comments, questions that anyone on the task force would like to make at this moment? Go ahead,
I just want to make a comment too, Steve. We're just waiting for the applications to open. There are projects just waiting for it to happen as far as that. So, I mean, we're waiting patiently. When the time comes, we'll be ready. We're not going to go, oh, we should think about this. It's being thought out. And then I just want to mention too, Mediacom has just launched Bolt, and that is a wireless solution, 100 by 10, going on to towers now. So that's quite a few areas of the state. I don't have a lot to comment on that as far as how it's working and how many people are taking it, but it's another solution. So, and Steve, too, just so you know too, a lot of these ISPs, I can't speak for all of them, but we are building out with or without these dollars. Things are happening behind the scenes with capital money. So again, we're not relying solely on the border-to-border program. So people are getting built too every day until the snow flies or the ground freezes.
Bernadine?
Yeah, I just want to publicly, again, thank the Office of Broadband Development and Diane in particular for her really extraordinary stepping up and presenting at this series of 8 regional broadband meetings that have been held across the state. The next one, as she said, the last one is tomorrow night. And so thank you so much. And I think it's been that the communities have appreciated being able to hear from them. Diane presented the maps, talked about the work of the office, and the buzz across the state in county courthouses and township houses. How are we going to take advantage of these funding opportunities, and what do we need to do? So I really appreciate that. And the other quick thing is to just encourage the task force members to consider joining us at the conference this next Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday mornings. I did put that link in the chat. It'll be a chance for people to hear from folks across the state who've been working on broadband in their communities. And we've had over probably 250 people in regional meetings talking about what their priorities are, what their needs are, what's working well. And if anybody in the task force wants to kind of a lean in, finger tip feel of conversations across the state, this would be a good chance. So just wanted to encourage folks to consider joining us for the conference this week.
Great. Thank you, Bernadine. Thanks for that announcement. Other comments from the task force members? Okay, any other comments from anyone else on the call that may not be on the task force that would like to announce at this moment? Okay. I'm not seeing any hands or anybody coming off mute. So with that, thank you very much for your engagement today. Thank you for all the subgroups, for all the work to start getting to a spot where we're getting closer to putting some recommendations together. Thank you, Scott, for helping with the format as well as sort of corralling everything together. I think we're going to be in a good spot. And then November, similar type of format. We'll dedicate plenty of time for discussions on the recommendations. We may have them in a format where it's more digestible as well. And if there's any information that can go ahead in advance, we'll do that as well. And then we'll keep you posted as well on if there's any actions that need to be taken into account prior to our meeting. Those will be done by email. So in any case, with that, I hope you have a good rest of the day and good rest of the week. Take care, everyone.